So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We really appreciate you coming and hearing three experts talk about one of the most important topics you can cover in international business, and that's what are the cross-cultural issues that you'll be dealing with and how do you handle them? My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder of Global Chamber. We are really thrilled on a weekly basis to be able to bring you 2 or 3 different programs that cover different topics to help you become more successful with your international business. Our first speaker today is Lelani Craig. She's calling in from Salt Lake City, Utah, where she's the CEO of CommGap. We love working with Lelani. Her company does translation and interpretation. She travels the world. She serves companies all over the world. We get members who use her services with big smiles built into the emails that they send back to us. They're very happy with working with her team. Lelani, I understand you're going to be kicking off today and talking about interpretation versus translation and relational type issues like that. So thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for being a member and supporter, and we look forward to hearing more.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate the introduction and being part of this amazing team that you put together. So thank you so much for that. Obviously, since my expertise is in translation and interpretation, I will use some of those components as part of what I talk about today. Translating for an international market has many focuses. Not only do we look at the culturally appropriate content, but we also deal with what the source language is being translated from into the target language the language is going into. When you're selecting a target language, you have to be very mindful that Spanish is not simply Spanish. Spanish has many different cultural forms, and the same goes for many other languages. And Todd, that comes after me, is one of those experts that can speak to that. There are many things that affect the translation, not just the language itself, the country where it's going to, the culture within that country. Even within the United States, there are different cultures based on the location of where your translation will be targeted. Included with that is the translation age that you're targeting, or the gender, what type of detail is involved with that. There are many different cultural differences across the globe, and when doing translation, you have to be very careful that you're doing the translation correctly. One of the key rules in the language industry is that translators who are properly trained, certified, and have the experience always work into their native language. That makes a huge difference. There are cultural references that we look for, such as food, festivals, beliefs, date, currency. All of those things need to be localized. Understanding local beliefs, such as the usage of healers or alternative medicines, that affects even healthcare or medical translations that we work on, and something that clients should really focus on. The source language, the semantics, the meaning behind what is written may be different than what you want, that the way it comes out in the target language. So doing a straight translation may not work for what you're trying to do. Keep that in mind as you consider how you're going to be culturally appropriate when transferring meaning into a new language. And keep in mind some of the basic things that people will look at, some of the touch points, such as your website, the marketing material, the documentation. One size does not fit all. So consider who you're selling to, who you're working with, who your client, who your audience is, when you dive into translation, into working into different languages. Even basic things like translating into French, going into Canada versus going into France, some countries in Africa that speak French. A lot needs to be considered when you're working with global content. In keeping in mind that even basic things like slangs and expressions, references, all of those do not have one single translation option. Language evolves and changes. A translator that hasn't kept up with training and understanding of the language will be providing translation that's 20 years old when it comes to terminology. So we try to keep that in mind when we work with clients, when we consult. When we do a translation job, it includes a lot of cultural consulting and making sure that clients understand. So working with experts, working with people who can give you the correct information makes a huge difference. When it comes to language services, like I said before, one size does not fit all. There are many different options that you have to keep in mind when working into that. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. One question we already have, and I'll definitely recommend anyone who's watching that has a question, go into either the chat area, the Q&A area, or send us an email at info@globalchamber.org. So any three option will get the question in. And so the first question relates to something you said about looking at your website, and you went through a series of things. So most people, if they look at all of that stuff, they'll view it through their own filter of, this looks good in English, or it might even look good in Chinese, but they don't speak Chinese or have the sub.
Right.
So how should a company look at those things? What's the process that someone looks at all those different elements?
When looking at the process of things like a website, understand that your audience that you're trying to hit with your information. If you're trying to translate it into Chinese, understand the audience that is reading it. Things such as color and content, even layout will probably have to be slightly adapted. Always understand who you're trying to sell to. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people add the Google translation bug, and it does an automatic translation. And it can be quite embarrassing, some of the things that come out of that translation bug. It is not appropriate for business. We love Google Translate. It has many great applications, but selling and trying to sell your business is probably not the right application for that. And the time will come when that will probably be appropriate, but it's not today. So keep that in mind. Don't try to cut corners if you really want to expand globally.
Thank you, and definitely reach out to experts along the way. And
Definitely.
One of those, so thank you for that starter information. Our next speaker is Todd Cornell of Culture 668. He's also the Executive Director for Global Chamber in Northern Colorado. I've seen Todd work firsthand with a delegation from China in Los Angeles, and it was masterful, an entire full day. And he did look tired at the end of the day, and I can tell you it was a lot of work going between English and Chinese with a number of them and a number of Americans, and finding a way to develop trust on both sides. And so really appreciate what you do, Todd. You're going to be talking about a few things today, including diplomacy and respect across cultures, business styles, and communication styles. Thanks for all you do. Look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And also, I just would like to remind everybody that we're still in Chinese New Year's. I think it's the third day or the fourth day it might be in China. So it's still a good time to say Happy New Year, Gong Xi Fa Cai. I would like to also just follow up a little bit with the discussion about translation. One thing that I'd like to say is that translation is usually, from my understanding and being involved with the American Translation Association, translation is speaking to usually documents and books and things like that. When we're talking translation, and I know a lot of people don't understand this because there's not that direct interaction. What's the difference between translation and interpretation? Interpretation is when you have people sitting there talking for you, so they're translating or interpreting. It's so hard, those two get really confused, but it's really important to understand. When we speak of translation, we're talking about documents, written things. Yes, very much, it's important to have a native speaker. But when you're having an interpreter, you may not necessarily be able to have a native speaker for both of the languages that are being interpreted. So it's finding the proper people with the skill sets that are necessary in order to get done what needs to be done. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I'm an interpreter, I'm not a translator, unless it's going from Chinese into English. So to begin off with what I want to share, first of all, I want to just say, don't misinterpret your style as the gold standard. When we do that, we're just asking for problems. We need to be open to recognize that there's a lot of different styles out there, and those can be cultural, just like what Lelani was speaking to earlier about the different cultural aspects in translation and interpretation and in your website and all of those things. So diplomacy and respect across cultures, basically, that comes down to me that it's the relationship in a lot of situations that are the foundation for good business. Obviously, we have to take into consideration that we're dealing with different cultures, such as Western cultures, and there's a variation like Lelani spoke to. Then we're getting into the cultures that are not similar to our Western mindset, if you are Western. And that would be like the Middle East, the Far East, the Near East, the Southeast. All of these different areas have different cultural things. And so that it's really important to recognize that some of the things that they do may seem weird, may seem different, or it may seem like it's familiar, but actually it could be different than how you're interpreting it. So it's very important to be sensitive to those things. There's a good expression in Chinese that's called 修同存异, and it means to focus on the similarities and save the differences. And this was something that a Chinese delegation years ago in Malaysia applied in order to be able to find a way to find a balance between the two approaches or the many approaches actually from the different cultural backgrounds that were coming into play at a meeting. So it's finding similarities, but at the same time recognizing that there are differences, and then finding the people that can help you to bridge those differences. That's really important. So don't take things at face value. There's always more than one possibility of understanding things. You may think you're understanding it, but if you talk to somebody who really understands the culture, you may find out that your understanding is actually a misunderstanding. And so those are important things to take into consideration. For business style, business is influenced by the cultural mindset. And so when working with cultures that are different, such as China, which is where I tend to do most of my work, it's important to understand their mindset. It's important to understand their way of doing things, and having people there who are able to help you to make sure you're doing things the right way so that you're not causing any unnecessary difficulties or challenges between you and the people that you're dealing with. And adjust your time frame too. That's a really important thing. Don't try and speed up when you're going into a new culture. Actually slow down, because when you're slowing down, you're giving more opportunity to understanding what's going on. Maybe give a buffer zone in your time frame. Actually add some extra time to allow yourself an extra day rather than, oh, let's try and do this in 2 days. Maybe we want to look at doing it in 3 days. The communications, breaking it up a little bit, taking it a little bit slower, especially when you're going into those Eastern sorts of cultures. They tend to be a slower culture. And I think going into some Latino cultures also, we find that. The communication styles are also influenced a lot by the cultural backgrounds and the mindsets. So we need to be sensitive to those different cultural forms of communication. As Lelani spoke about, there's a lot of different things within the languages, and those things also affect the way people communicate. And then there's also using the language in a way that that you're not taking things for face value. For instance, there's an expression in Chinese, 以后再说, which literally translated means we'll talk about it later. But when the Chinese use that statement, they're usually trying to say, okay, that's cool, but I don't want to talk about this anymore. So it's having the sensitivity and having the knowledge that there are certain situations that may be different than what it appears to be. So using cross-cultural talent who are linguistically qualified is really important in being able to have a successful endeavor with cultures. And there again, we need to really look at this need for, do we want to use somebody who actually comes from this culture, or do we want to use somebody who comes from my culture and understands their culture? This is an important thing. And when you're going into those Eastern cultures, I think that it's important to find somebody who's coming from our cultural background and is understanding how to go into that culture, because there can many times be a lot of challenges with using the local people. Sometimes in China, if you're taking and you're using a local person or a person from that background and you go back into China with them, there's a lot of pressure on them to work for the Chinese because they are Chinese. And so that's something that doesn't happen when you're dealing with a person who's taking you in, who is coming from your background, which also will gain respect from the Chinese because they understand them and they appreciate them. And so these are some of the aspects that I think are important to consider when going into other cultures for successful business. Thank you. 谢谢.
谢谢. Thank you very much, Todd. And so we're exactly right on time. So Gloria, thank you so much for speaking today. Gloria Petersen of the Global Protocol Academy. You know, she's a longtime member of Global Chamber. She's an amazing expert on not just intercultural and cross-border issues, but also just generally professionalism. And she's spent a career and many years working with companies to help their young people become professional and help just in general professionals become more professional in their work. And so today Gloria is going to be talking about respecting cultural etiquette and protocols, how to avoid slang, idioms, and colloquialisms, and then understanding body language so that you and whoever you're dealing with can be more comfortable. And I'm sure there'll be other topics as well. Gloria, thank you so much for all your support and collaboration, and look forward to hearing from you today. Oh, and so Gloria's muted, and I think we better get her presentation up. Gloria, are you there? Uh-oh. That's a problem. Anybody there on either end of things?
Hey Doug, trying to unmute Gloria, but it's not allowing me.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, that's unfortunate. So Gloria, if you can hear us, try unmuting yourself, and maybe that's the problem. It's a local muting. Well, that is something that we've not seen before. So it reminds me of so many other cross-cultural and cross-border issues that happen is, you know, one of the things, and we'll handle it until we're told that Gloria is ready. You know, when you're doing business and work across borders, you have to react to the situation. And we've all seen people react badly to a variety of or maybe at least one situation. One of the things that I admire Todd so much for is his ability to stay calm and cool, and I've seen him on multiple occasions. But Todd, your experience in the experience we shared in Los Angeles with those Chinese visitors, there was some pressure along the way, right? We were traveling to multiple locations, to the mayor's office, to the convention center, to the port of Los Angeles, and you were able to kind of keep it cool. You know, how do you find, and are you able to guide people in terms of trying to stay cool, calm, and collected as they're dealing with potentially stressful situations?
Well, I think that the best way to do that is just to try and stay cool. I think that emotions are easily passed between us, and what's the word, that they're contagious. And so I think that just trying to stay cool, taking a deep breath and just relaxing, and yeah, I don't know. I try not to think about it, because the more you think about it, the more stressed you get. So
Got
You
it.
know, I mean, this is an interesting twist on the whole culture thing. When you're dealing with other cultures, especially in a business setting, this does happen. You will be in uncomfortable situations, or perhaps realize that you're not fully understanding what's going on.
right.
And how you deal with that makes or breaks what's happening. Oh, I see a question. How does one go about choosing the right language services provider to work with, since there are so many to choose from? Yeah.
You want to answer that diplomatically, or how would you like to answer?
No, I think, you need to decide what exactly you're trying to achieve, because not every provider, language service provider, offers the same amount of services. So as you're looking, if you decide I need to work, I need someone to help me achieve this, then you interview a few language services providers, find out from them what is their strength, what is their focus, what do they specialize in? Because many claim to do everything and absolutely anything, but the reality is that you have to work with subject matter specialists, people who are trained experts in what they're dealing with. Todd is one of those. He is very much an expert in his area, and picking someone who has that expertise is essential. Make sure that the language service provider has what you need, has the ability to provide the quality, and that will require you to do some homework. So
there's also a market segment issue potentially as well,
yes.
right? So
Yes.
I used to be in the rubber industry, and there's certain things in the elastomer
exactly.
area that that are not obvious to everyone. A lot of those things
Yes.
can be worked through, but if you're translating a document, that's another thing. But in terms of
Yes.
interpretation within, some of that stuff can be overcome by bad translation that can then
Yes.
be understood in real time, right?
The damage from poor translation or poor interpretation services can be, difficult to overcome. So you need to make sure you're using someone who's a proper expert. In the interpreting world, there are medical interpreters, and they take medical classes and they certify in that. There are legal interpreters, they are court certified. They can work with legal terminology and understand the nuance. There are conference interpreters. They can interpret simultaneously at the same time as a speaker, something that a lower level interpreter won't be able to keep up with. So a lot of content will be lost. There are different types of interpreters. Those that only work remotely, those that work side by side, those who work over the phone. Translation is the same way. The experts specialize in a topic and in part of the country, and it's something that makes them very well trained and will do the best work for you. An agency will hopefully take the time to gather those experts and put them into teams so they work on your project and you have several people involved.
Part of that is also regionalization, right? So like different parts of the country have a different, I'm not sure actually what it is in English, but in Japanese it's ben, maybe dialect, or maybe that's the right word. So Cajun versus New Jersey versus West
Right.
Coast versus Ohio. If you've been around the country, you get a sense of where somebody might be from based on what they're saying. Usually a lot of the words don't change, but in other countries it can, right? So how do you dial that in, especially Lelani, many of your clients are working in countries all over the world that have those issues. And Todd, China's so large and so diverse in terms of the dialects. Those are issues that become very significant.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to your previous conversation too, as far as the translation piece and the interpreting and using services. As for myself, I don't market myself as an interpreter because that's an innate aspect of the services that I offer. And when we're looking for a translation service or just an interpreter, it's usually in a situation where there's not a need for ulterior information about the culture so much. It's like you're just needing a person who's able to supply you the services that you need to get this document translated, or to continue a conversation where you're not looking for consulting from that person as far as cultural background information, how to work with that culture, how to work with certain aspects. And so when we're getting into, and another thing too is for the translation piece, in reality, there is the necessity of having native speakers from both sides, because you're going to have a team doing a good translation. You need the initial translator, and then you need an editor who is the native speaker of the language it's going into. And so there's so many nuances that are taking place here within a translation service or an interpreting service versus a service or a consultant that takes you into the country and helps you establish the relationships, helps you understand how to maneuver the culture, how to maneuver the different aspects in communications, negotiations, and whatnot. So as far as China and all of the dialects, it's basically Mandarin, because that's the language that people are educated in. And so everybody speaks Mandarin. They may speak Shanghainese or Cantonese or whatever at home or within their community, but the language of communication and business and education is Mandarin.
Okay, I'd like to pause for a second and circle back with you, Lelani, but first, Gloria, it sounds like we have you back on, so if we could have your presentation, Cesar, and then Gloria, we're glad to have you. So we look forward to hearing more from you. Sorry for the technical problems.
Oh, well, technical problems happen. It's just part of the game.
So we're on your first slide. Hopefully you can see this. Tips for effective cross-cultural communication. Please go ahead.
Okay, I can't see the slides up, but you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. So just let us know when you'd like it switched and we'll tell you which slide you're on.
Okay, wonderful. We'll just go from there. Just to start out, first of all, realizing that cross-cultural communication, it has many parts. From an international communication perspective, it involves an understanding of how people from different cultures speak, how we communicate, how we see the world around us, as we've already learned from Lelani and Todd. However, if communication styles are not respected at the onset, that's when cultural issues start to intervene. Most cultures have specific etiquettes around the way they communicate. Before you meet, you should research the target culture if time allows, do some cross-cultural training. Many cultures have a degree of formality, and that's probably one of the biggest issues at the beginning of communication between individuals. Here's the thing, not every culture is on first name basis at the onset. And we in America, we're so easy with that. We're so free-flowing with first names only. We just assume too often the rest of the world has the same protocol, and that's not the case. So when you err on the side of formality, you're much safer. You can relax the name exchange later if that permission is granted. That's why in this particular slide, I talk about the greeting. When you first walk into the room, certainly there's going to be a name exchange, and I'm going to give you a little bit more about the name exchange details on the next slide. But the handshake, we in America like a nice, firm handshake. That means we're getting down to business. And if you have a weaker handshake, then we assume a weaker personality or somebody who's just very insecure. Not so. In other cultures, like in a lot of the Asian cultures, for example, and I know Todd can speak to this, the handshake might be a little lighter. So you kind of have to gauge your handshake based on the recipient's handshake to find out where that is, because you don't want to create a fence. And again, there's the bow versus the handshake. I had a situation once where I was with a delegation where we were going to meet some people from South Korea. And I saw them at the elevators. We're at the Hyatt, a huge hotel, coming around the corner with my colleague. Well, my colleague immediately ran up to them and extended that handshake and wanted to do the good old American handshake. And they stiffened up like boards. And I saw this coming. I held back. I made a much slower approach and waited till they were comfortable with me and to determine whether or not the handshake was even going to be appropriate. In that particular situation, because spouses were also present, the handshake was not appropriate. It was uncomfortable. So you really have to understand where that handshake has its place. And if you are going to bow, and again, Todd could speak to this, I'm sure Lelani could too, there are different significance to the level of the bow. So you have to be very, very careful with that. On the business card exchange, and I know a lot of us in America are not even relying on the business cards so much anymore. We're using our phones to take pictures of business cards or to have information transferred, but have a lot of business cards with you. It's still a very, very important document. And when you take out your business card, a protocol I'd like to have you visualize is taking out your business card. Look at your name. Is your name facing you or is it facing the recipient? It should face the recipient. Take the time to turn the card around so that when you do extend it, and certainly in some cultures, holding the card by both corners is more appropriate, more respectful. They heard your name. Now they can see your name, and that helps memory to have that name intact. And then, have the card and exchange it back. Another protocol would be to ask for the card before you offer yours. Too often we treat business cards like a deck of cards and start passing them around. No, let's slow down a bit and just say, may I have your business card? I'd like to stay in contact, receive it appropriately. Then you might say, may I offer you yours? That would be a polite protocol, and certainly present yours the correct way in the business card. But going to the next slide, I kind of want to talk about this naming system because we are so first name basis that in some cultures, there is quite a process to the naming system. There are many components. There's a title, a given name, a middle name, a surname, a mother's name, a father's name, a generation or a grandfather's name, a clan name, a birth city, a married name. All these could be part of that whole naming system. Ours is real easy. We have a first, middle, and last name, and not so in some cultures. So understand the meaning of the names, and usually their name gives you history. Our names, not so much, but other cultures, they do. So it's very important to understand that name. We tend to want to take very long, extended names and shorten them. And that's kind of rude, but be careful with that. Also, titles. Just don't go to the first name. Title first. In Germany, title, extremely important. You might not, in China, for example, you might not get permission to use their first name for a long period of time. So understand how their titles work, what their titles are. And I've got a list of them here, which, Sheikh, Doctor, Herr Doctor, Frau, Fraulein, Senor, Senorita, they understand what all these things mean when you look at the name and get a good background on the name. Now we can move on from the names, and I've got a nice slide there for those of you who keep these to kind of familiarize yourselves with that process. And the next thing that we deal with, and that's the next slide, is on colloquialisms or, just shortcuts. We might be in a conversation and make a comment and say, you hit it out of the park. Well, we're saying that's a win, but they might not understand what that meant. They have to process, I hit it out of the park, and their mind is going to a park. Another one is a no-brainer. That's another one we are very freewheeling with. And it's, it's just a comment that requires a little thought. My favorite one is the next one. An experience I had was with an a young student from India. His name was Sanjay, and he was at the University of Chicago. He was telling me a story of how he was with a group of colleagues, American students, and they were having a conversation, and he made a comment, and his student friend said, "Sanjay, get out of here." Well, Sanjay thought he said something wrong, so he walked away. Then they said, "Sanjay, where are you going?" "Well, you told me to get out of here." And he was so confused. He came back and learned that he had just said something very profound, had nothing to do with him leaving or, quote, getting out of here, but he said something profound. So that's just an example of how we are so quick to go to these first names, or not first names, I'm so quick to use these colloquialisms, these slangs, that they are not easily understood. Just like jokes, you have to be very careful. I recommend not telling a joke. You have to be very, very careful with your use of jokes. And I'm going quickly here because I know my time is short. But then, then we have the deal of gestures. Understand the gestures. Our gestures that we understand may not be as understood or understood in the same way when we're with another culture. For example, that AOK sign with the circle. In France, you could be telling somebody they're worthless with that sign. In Japan, it's money. In Brazil, it's a very rude gesture. And a story I'll share with you on a young man who was sent to Brazil to represent his company in the final stages of a proposal. And this is regarding a water filtering system. And he had different colleagues at the table. It was a very large table. And when they got to the point where they felt like it was a done deal, he quite right away to his other colleague at the other end of the table put up his OK sign. Well, everything went into dead silence because he so offended them with that gesture. And they didn't understand what he didn't understand that he just gave them a very offensive gesture. So be careful. The thumbs up, that's A-OK in our culture, but in other culture, it might mean something very different. The showing hand is probably the easiest. And when you're going to point at something or show directions, instead of using your finger to point, put your palm up and show the way instead of point the way. It's a much safer gesture. Just kind of going through things very, very quickly here on just some of the things that we need to be sure we have in place at the onset, because you certainly don't want to offend at the very beginning of an interaction. That guarantees that the interaction will go much smoother. And that concludes my tips.
Oh, okay. Very good. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And so we got the end of your slide deck, Gloria. So what we'll do now is we'll entertain questions. We've got about 20 minutes, so send your questions into those 3 locations. One of the next questions is about home field advantage. So one of the things, Todd, that you talked about was having people from both cultures in the same room that are working on either the interpretation or translation. And is there ever a home field advantage when you're traveling to China, let's say? Does an American company view that as definitely not home field, but when they're in the US, are there things that they can get away with or are more acceptable if they're in the US? How does that work either when you're traveling or when you're hosting visitors?
That I'm not completely sure I understand the question, but I'm going to try and answer. So I think that just being within our own cultural environment, which is what I would consider as being the home, the benefit of being in the home, what did you call it? Being in our own culture environment, I think we're more comfortable in a lot of ways. But I think some of the challenges is when we're not aware of the switch between other cultures. And a lot of times I find that American companies tend to think that other companies and other cultures will just deal with them the way they're used to being dealt with, or else just sense that when I go to this culture, when I go anywhere, everybody just sort of deals with us from our cultural perspective. So it's almost like they're wanting to take home everywhere they go. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and that's where I say just don't think that your standard, your style is the golden standard, your practice or whatever. It's always best to go into any situation expecting it to be different. If you expect it to be the same, then you're only looking for challenges. But being at home is always more comfortable.
And that actually, and I'll let all three of you address this question. It's the next question actually relates to that is the concept that foreigners outside the US, so non-US people, tend to adjust their language to non-native speakers to avoid entering slang and colloquialisms and other confusing things. However, English speakers tend to assume everyone will understand those slang or their approach. How can business in the US and other English-speaking countries better adjust to modify their speaking to avoid confusing others? And are there techniques that the three of you use to get people to kind of realize that they need to adjust?
I think that, and I'll just take it really quick, I think that the first thing is education and sensitivity. It's a skill set. It's not something that we're born with. It's not something that we're educated about. It's a skill set, and we need to build up those skill sets and work with people who have them.
Yeah, and I go back to what I said earlier, know who you're trying to sell to. So like Todd said, education, but also understanding and knowing what your weaknesses are. Mm-hmm. If you don't understand, find an expert who can fill that void. Don't try to make up or, just kind of push aside. If you have a weakness, get the help that you need.
And my point would be, watch the body language. When we get into conversations, it's extremely easy for us to use slangs or colloquialisms that we're not even thinking ahead that they might not understand. It just comes out, just flows out. But watch the body language. If you see a discomfort or a confusion in their facial expression or confusion, right away realize that what you just said did not come across appropriately or it was not understood. And back up a minute, take that comment, whatever you just said, and rephrase it or explain it. What I meant to say was, et cetera, et cetera. Just watch the body. When they're uncomfortable, you will see it in the body language immediately, and that's a sign for you to stop, back up, re-explain, or represent the comment.
I'll say I agree, but at the same time, sometimes I know that in China, in Chinese culture, the more you try and explain yourself out of a situation, the deeper you get into it. So it takes a sensitivity to be able to find a balance. Yeah.
And please avoid jokes. Jokes should have no place in any type of international communication. Most are impossible to translate. The sense of humor varies by country. So you may offend someone or completely make them feel like you don't connect with them.
Or respect them.
Yeah.
Jokes, and I presume you would also recommend that religious topics or politics.
Yeah. Sometimes in American culture, when we put together a PowerPoint, we like to have funnies, and it's just something to break the ice. That should not be included when working with other cultures.
Got it. So be serious, professional.
Yes.
Gloria, you do a lot. The Academy, the Global Protocol Academy does that type of training, right? To teach people, to be professional and what being professional means, including if you're communicating across borders.
Yeah, one of the biggest things at the Global Protocol Academy that I find is so many, especially the young people here, don't even understand the culture they're in, and yet they're going to go abroad and try to understand that culture. So I spend a lot of time at the Academy explaining what the protocol and etiquette expectations of this country are. I mean, I'll actually go back to George Washington's Rules of Civility, move forward and talk about what has changed, what has not changed, but they really do need to have a very good understanding of our culture, our etiquettes, our protocols, There's a lot of mixed messages out there. Hate to say it, but a lot of mixed messages, not only out into the environment, but in the technology, all of that. And it's creating some confusion. I think that's why we're being offensive, unintentionally being offensive, because we don't know we are, because we don't even understand our own culture. So I spent a lot of time on that before moving into international or cultural type situations.
Okay, that's a really good point. I think many international business people might take 5 or 10 years of travel, and then they start to understand, their own culture a lot better. How can that be accelerated? I presume, there's training and education that can be done to get there faster. Are you three aware of ways that people can accelerate that process? If you're in a business and you're mainly selling in the US, and now suddenly over the next 6 to 12 months, you're trying to go to 3 or 5 different countries, and you may not have had any international experience. How do you get there? What do you do to get to that next level quickly?
I think you're cautious. I don't think that having the fast food mentality going into that is necessarily a smart idea. I think maybe pick one, move into it, get some understanding, get some experience, and then look at another, or two similar, maybe at the same time, if they're two similar cultural backgrounds, two similar markets. But biting off too much may actually not be a good thing.
And with all the cultural differences, there are cultural similarities. They may be small, but if you find that similarity point, you can use that to connect and grow from there. But both Todd and Gloria said, slow down a little bit, take the time, and I agree with that. It takes time to understand, and if it's happening faster than you can handle, by all means, find an expert. When we deal with translations for clients that we know are going into an international market, we do a lot of cultural consulting with a client to make sure that everyone understands. It takes time.
Todd, you lived in China over 20 years. At what point did you feel like you were comfortable? How many years did it take, or days, or hours?
Well, it's sort of an interesting thing, but it was an up and down experience. And in the beginning, it was the excitement of the newness, and everything was new and different. And then it started getting frustrating. And I remember at one point after 6 years where I ran into the cultural linguistic Great Wall, where I realized that what I was hearing and understanding was not what was being said. And so that was what sort of took me into a realization that things don't mean what it sounds like when I'm interpreting it from my English background in the words that I'm seeing or that I'm hearing, that there's a lot more going on. Just sort of like what I mentioned earlier about when people say 以后再说, eventually you realize that doesn't mean I want to talk about it. It means I don't want to talk about it. And so there's so many different nuances and aspects. And I think that Chinese culture may well be one of the most difficult because it is so profound, going probably close to the Middle East and all of these cultures that have been around for thousands of years. I was just thinking about an expression from the Art of War when we were talking about the response to the question that you asked earlier, Doug, and it's 知己知彼，百战不殆. So know yourself and know the person you're interacting with. That's the way to be successful, and that's what Sun Tzu said thousands of years ago. How are you successful in a battle or at war or in marketing? You know yourself and you know your opponent. You know the person you're interacting with. That's, I think, how it has to happen.
Lelani and Gloria, when did you know yourself? And then when you're dealing with clients, how do you get them to accelerate that process, especially if they don't know themselves, right? Unfortunately, many don't. So how do you get them there? What's your experience with that? And of course, when did you guys feel like you had made it in terms of kind of understanding, at least at a level where you're very comfortable?
I was raised in 2 countries, and that alone, I feel like gave me a bit of an advantage, because you grow up understanding 2 different cultures and you see the differences. So it allows you also to look at another culture and realize, no, that's not what it seems. So the exposure to other cultures is great. And go into it with an open heart and an open mind, being willing to learn, not being the person that comes with all the answers.
Got it. Which two countries did you grow up in, or which?
Argentina and the US.
In the US, okay. Got it. Gloria, how about you? When did you feel like you understood it all, or at least to some point where you felt quite comfortable that you'd had most of it figured out?
I'm not sure I ever feel that I feel quite like that. I just kind of spend a lot of time observing, watching the body language, participating in the conversation as comfortably as I can. If I don't understand something or I feel confused, I ask questions and try to get some clarity. I think when I do that, when I exercise that and get the understanding from my own perspective, then that's when I feel like I'm starting to be more successful.
Okay, great.
And there's certainly, we didn't have time to cover this here, but I remember when I was in Brazil, just realizing just the dining part of it, it never occurred to me that they would be uncomfortable. They don't pick up their food with their hands, they strictly use utensils. And so when I remember once I picked up something with my hands and I got that look from them like, and I thought, oh, what did I do wrong? And immediately I stopped and asked, and my counterpart said, well, we don't use our hands for that particular food. Oh, okay. And just accepting the situation for what it was and admitting I made an error.
China's very similar.
Chopsticks
work great.
What are next question is, what are some of the successes that you see on a routine basis, and then what are some of the common mistakes that companies make as they're going overseas?
In the Todd.
Oh,
okay. In the translation industry, there are different processes when it comes to translating, let's say, a document. You can do a straight translation. A birth certificate would be, you just translate it. Whereas a marketing piece requires a different approach. And one of the mistakes that I noticed with companies is they assume translation is translation. If we are given a marketing piece, we do more of a transcreation approach, where it's a combination of translation with creative writing. So we are taking the thought and the intent of the marketing message to put it into the other language. So I think that's one of the mistakes that I notice the most, is that companies just translate. They also don't take the time to have a team, a translator, a proofreader, an editor, and finally someone doing quality assurance at the end to make sure it all comes together. Another mistake is consistency. You maintain a glossary, you maintain translation memory, so you have consistency in every other translation after the first one. So keep that in mind as you're building for international. Make sure you have a style guide. Make sure you have a glossary of the words in your company. Create consistency in English before you try to put it into another language.
And I think, Todd, you can probably speak to this one, because you and I had this conversation yesterday about just how we Americans tend to talk too much, over talk, if you will. And sometimes it's better just to be quiet, listen, and take in what's being said. We don't like silence. And maybe, Todd, you can address, the Chinese feeling on, the value of silence, or a moment of silence, or a quiet moment where we tend to talk right into it.
Right. I think that it's just that from my perspective in dealing with China, we don't want to give everything away. We want to just give the information that's necessary in order to establish the portion of the relationship that we're in now. It's a strategy. Dealing with China should be a strategy. It should be regarded as a strategy. I think going into any country, any market should be looked at as a strategy. We shouldn't just do it because we feel like it, or just go over without any of that previous understanding. So I would think that to answer the question, it would be the relationship. I think the relationship is probably the most important thing that you want to spend the time on. What happens for a lot of US companies, they go to China or they go to other countries and they expect them to respect them from their understanding of law and legal ideals. And legalities are very different in different countries. They're dealt with differently, they're responded to differently, and China is one area where a relationship is more important than a legal document. So if you have an agreement, that agreement is basically just a guide for where we can move in the direction we're going. It's the relationship that's going to make the agreement successful, not the legalities, because when you put the Chinese under a legal pressure, that destroys the relationship. And without a relationship, you can't be successful. So I think relationship is really one of the most important, but unfortunately, relationships are not nurtured in China or a lot of other countries the way we do. So it's being able to change your ability to create relationships with people in other cultures that you may not understand, and that's where you need the experts.
It can be so difficult when things are getting so much busier and busier that sometimes, unfortunately, might be a place where you shortcut.
Right.
You know, and I've noticed it's an interesting dynamic, I think, in this group here with Lelani in particular. You may not be familiar with this type of a call because she's been so polite, and part of it is the way she's been upbringing. Todd and I actually, Lelani, have talked about this because he and I have a lot of experience in Asia, and we tend to be the way you are in this call today, more polite. And many times I've been on calls with Europeans or Americans, especially years and years ago, where I couldn't get a word in edgewise. They don't stop talking. They don't have the sensitivity that you have, probably because of your Argentine background. And also I think women tend to be better listeners and wait for the person to finish talking, pause, and then start. And so I think that goes to a really good best practice anywhere in the world, is let the person finish what they're saying, notice the pause, and then interject. The problem is, in a setting like this, you might not get a word in edgewise, and so it's very important to get your words in as well.
Oh, well, thank you.
Oh, our pleasure. So Gloria, I'm sure you've seen that as well, and so you teach people to find ways to get their words across, but also do it in a respectful way.
I always
thank you in
recommend
Chinese Sign Language, Lelani.
Oh,
谢谢. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, I try to encourage, if it's possible, to have a notepad, because I'm a horrible person at interruptions. I know that, and I work on it all the time. I talk too fast. I know that too. So I try to think in terms of speaking in sound bites or phrases and slowing it down to discipline myself. And when I am in a conversation, I try to have a notepad. And if a thought comes that I think is important to deliver, I'll write it down real quick. And when my time comes, I've got it captured. I think we interrupt because we feel that a thought that came into our head was extremely important, and we need to throw it in there right now before we forget it. And certainly I'm guilty of that. So I just encourage anyone, if it's possible, to have a small notepad or something, so when you do get a thought or an idea that you feel is valuable to the conversation, jot it down. Then when you have that opportunity to offer it, you haven't lost it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Absolutely. So we've come to the hour end already. I can't believe it. So that went by way too fast. Sorry for the technical problems, but I think we got enough.
Yeah, my apology on the technical. My apology. It was my mistake. I hit a button wrong, and then I lost everything. So it's like, keep your hands off your computer, off your gadgets.
No worries at all. I'm glad we were able to include your presentation, Gloria. And so those of you out there, don't let this be the last conversation we have on this topic. This is something that's a lifelong learning experience as you build your global business from one culture to the next, to continually learn. And we never quite reach the end. So reach out to these three experts, to Lelani, to Todd, to Gloria. If you have any trouble, find them in the directory for Global Chamber, reach out to info@globalchamber.org, and we'll be happy to make sure that you're connected to them. Our next presentation is actually in 2 days, and it's going to be about success in China. And lo and behold, Todd is going to be one of the three expert speakers on that. And we've got, I believe, a person from China, and I forget actually who the third one is, but it's a three expert panel on China. And then next week we have conversations about Brexit, and we've got basically 2 to 3 of these per week. That gives us an opportunity to talk about hopefully topics that matter to you. And so if you have some topics that matter and you haven't seen them recently, let us know. And we'll be happy to get them into the mix. We have 2 or 3 months of these mapped out, so keep us posted on things that are of interest, and we'll be happy to help. Thank you. Lelani,
Thank you.
Todd, Gloria, you're amazing. For all you do, thank you very much, and thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
everybody for attending.
Have a great